and welcome back to the HR L&D Podcast. My name is Nick Day, CEO of JGA Recruitment, Specialist HR Recruiters. Now, whether you are listening to this episode for the first time or the 100th time, please let me take this opportunity to say thank you for joining me today on what I think is going to be a fantastic conversation as we delve into the psychology and neuroscience behind human behaviour, behind leadership, and basically about unlocking the potential within people like you listening to this podcast. Now, before I introduce today's guest, please let me just say, if you enjoy the show, please do remember to subscribe to it. And of course, if you have a spare moment, please give it a little cheeky review as well. That'd be hugely appreciated. And of course, share it with all of our human resources and learning and development colleagues. So on to today's guest, because today I'm joined here by emotional intelligence, communication and leadership coach, Sumit Gupta, who is a qualified leadership coach who has worked with teams and individuals in India and throughout Europe for the past 15 years. He's researched and studied the psychology and neuroscience behind human behavior and leadership, and has used this knowledge to help others to realize how powerful and influential they are and can be. Now, Sumit coaches changemakers from both the business world in particular, as well as individuals, and he helps them to see past their own challenges to enable them to make a big impact in the world. I think it's fair to say that helping others to realize how powerful they can be is what Sumit's all about. It's what this podcast is all about. So that's why I've invited him today onto today's show, because I hope over the next 45 minutes or so, he's going to be able to unlock some of the greatness inside all of you. Yes, that's you, our listeners. So let's get started. Allow me to introduce Sumit Gupta to the show. Welcome, Sumit. How are you doing today?
I'm doing quite good. Thank you, Nick, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you here. Let me start with this opening question I give all my guests. What does the word or the phrase or the title human resources mean to you?
I think for me it's an evolving phrase. I think we are evolving from seeing people as resources to seeing people as people. So for me it's something which we have caught on from the 20th century, but I think it will evolve in the 21st century, and it is already evolving. To really see the potential in people for who they are, like seeds, which can grow, which can flourish and nourish, rather than a resource to be utilized for a particular project or business and so on.
Very nice. Now, I know that you talked about flourishing, and let's talk about your website, because on there, you mentioned that you regularly see very talented, very smart people undersell themselves, that they, as a result of that, they sometimes can limit their dreams, their desires, and their results. And you say it's because of three main factors. So rather than me tell the audience here, I wonder if you could just give us a flavour of what you think those three main factors are that are really limiting performance, or in particular context of this podcast, leadership capability.
Yeah. So I think one of the main reasons why I think even very successful people, very successful leaders feel like empty or hollow from the inside is the culture that we are living in. And I think it's a very interesting conversation where we are put down whenever we try to stand out. And especially if you look at organizations, people are always expected to behave according to a certain profile, to a certain job description. And anything which goes beyond that is, rather than seeing it as a unique trait of somebody, people are pushed down. And this also happens when we are growing up in our families, in our culture. We are asked to adhere to the rules of the school, to the rules of the community, to the rules of the family. And then anybody who tries to stand out does not fit in. And I think that's where imposter syndrome comes in. Like the feeling, the thought of feeling like a fake, or feeling like you do not deserve this, I think comes from this culture of growing up in a society where standing out for who you are and expressing yourself totally openly is not acceptable, or is still seen in a very, very negative light. So I think that's the biggest thing, that the society and the culture we grow up in does not allow us to be ourselves openly and express ourselves. And that stops us from actually dreaming big, going after what we dream, and to be just open to who we are authentically.
Okay, just to play devil's advocate with that slightly, do you not think as humans we need boundaries though? If we took those boundaries away, could it result in bedlam? We need rules. We need certain things to keep an order to things. So where does that boundary? Where does it leave us with those boundaries? What would you come back with that?
I think boundaries are very important, right? But boxes are not. What we are doing is putting people into boxes. When we label people as their role or as their nationality or as their title, we are putting people into boxes. Yes, boundaries are important. So that's where the values come in. The values of a society, the values of a company. And then if you cross those values, if you cross those standards, there are repercussions for that. Like we have laws in the society. So that's an example of creating boundaries that serve us. But then there have also been examples of boundaries within families or within organizations which does not adhere to any such globalized like value or standard, because every company, every family can have a different standard. So there is always the risk of overdoing it, and I think that's where we tend to be. So boundaries are very important. They are like the guardrails. So they will keep you safe. But if they start to stop you from doing what you want to do, then that's a freedom, I think, which every leader should have, is to shift the boundaries or to question the boundaries.
Okay, nice. So if we're focused then on leadership for a moment, what's the relationship from your perspective between leadership and learning, particularly for some very high level leaders we have listening to this HR L&D podcast, because HR directors, learning development directors and so on. What is that relationship?
To me, leadership is almost synonymous with learning. I wouldn't separate the two, and I wouldn't put in blocks for learning. The way I see it is that every opportunity or every moment and each conversation is an opportunity for learning. So learning only stops when we stop learning, rather than something in the outside environment. And especially in the kind of world we are living in, which is very volatile, which is very difficult to predict, with all of the uncertainty, being open to learning is the first step. So every conversation am I going into, am I open to learning something? Is there something which I might be missing, or is there something which might be new, or something which might be different from my point of view? So for me, learning happens on the job. First of all, learning happens all the time. The only question is, are we close to learning, and are we open to learning? And once we say, are we open to learning, first of all, that creates a mood of curiosity and openness, not just for you, but also for everybody around them. That immediately brings the tension down or stress down, even if there is any. So it has an impact on the mood itself, the energy itself of the team. But learning is there in every moment. So, and you can be very conscious about it, learn from coaches, learn from books, or you can also learn on the job from every interaction you have. And then ask yourself this question, right? What is it that am I not seeing here? What can I learn from this person, from this opportunity, from this conversation?
So it involves asking more questions of ourselves. Well, I guess you're an expert in unlocking potential. So do you find when you're dealing with senior leaders that sometimes when they feel they've hit a plateau or they've lost that motivation, it's because they've stopped learning or they've stopped consciously learning? Because we're not always talking about courses here. This isn't about necessarily undertaking a new study or going to do a new qualification, which can be quite a time steal, can be a huge commitment of resources. You're talking about everyday learning in every situation. So is this something that you're coming across with leaders who are feeling demotivated or are feeling a little bit stuck, and they've just lost that conscious learning bit? They're not, I don't know, what is it you find in leaders who are perhaps feeling a little bit unmotivated or stuck?
Yes. So I think one of my most fascinating discoveries is that every strength of yours becomes a weakness at some point of time. So everything which has brought you where you are today, if you are a leader, you are in a certain place, you are in a certain position, title, you have a certain amount of success behind you. Every skill which you call a strength, which has brought you where you are today, will become a weakness or will have a dark side. To give an example, if somebody who has been very hardworking, who has somebody been pushing through challenges by focusing their energies, and that has brought them success, can often result in burnout, can often result in creating a mood of frustration around the team. And then that person has to shift their emotional intelligence skills, as that person has to shift something so that their strength remains a strength. It does not stop them. They can use the positive side of the strength, and then they can learn something new for the next phase of their career. Another example is some people learn to collaborate and work. So they're very good collaborators, but they do not see discipline. They are not very good at execution, and that's very good in a particular kind of role or in a particular kind of companies. But suddenly, what happens is when you shift companies, or when the environment changes, the situation changes, like we're seeing with COVID, the same strength becomes a liability. So every strength you have, which has gotten you here, has a dark side. And first of all, are you aware of the cost of that? And then what are you willing to do about it? So these are two questions, I think, which comes up and make people struck. Yeah,
I've never considered that before, but actually it resonates with me. So I would actually say hardworking is one of my strengths, right? And certainly, I'm aware of things like burnout. But interestingly, when you're so focused on achieving a goal in your business life, it's like a yin and yang. It means that actually it can impact you negatively in your personal life. And actually, if you're frustrated at home because things, you haven't had the time with your children or your family, whatever it might be, that can also manifest itself in frustration at work. Whereas if I'm happy at home, I tend to be happier at work. But it's sometimes very difficult to get that balance when you're so head down working to achieve certain business goals. And actually they work very closely together. So I can understand. I would say it's definitely a strength of mine in a work context, but I would say it's a weakness of mine in a home context because I haven't quite got that balance right. So I'm guessing that's kind of one of the examples you may pick up on if we were chatting or we were working through so optimizing my work rate.
Yes, exactly. And to tie it with learning, being always in that action mode can actually stop you from listening, can stop you from empathizing with what is happening, because you're too focused on the project, on the task, on the activity, that you do not pay attention to what the other person is thinking, feeling, or might be thinking or feeling. So being very action oriented can actually take you away from being connected with the person, with the conversation, and that prevents you from learning what is very apparent to you if you slow down and if you pay your attention to the relationship, to the other person, or to the team in general.
So do you think, just using the last resonation for me really as an example, do you think leaders take enough time to self-reflect? Do you think we're so head down? And I would terminate, there's an up campaign of look up more and actually looking up from a strategic point of view, looking up just if you're outdoors. Do you think leaders spend enough time or dedicate enough time on self-reflection?
So I have seen both kinds of leaders. I know a lot of leaders who regularly take time off and put time in their calendar, either on a weekly basis, sometimes even multiple times a week, to reflect. To reflect alone, then to reflect with their teams, and then to reflect with their organizational leadership. So reflection can also happen on multiple levels. But at the same time, I also know a lot of people who do not take that time, or who see that taking that time is actually a waste of time, or to always be focused on the results, always be focused on driving progress rather than stopping. And one of the phrases which I love and which I try to use with leaders is that slow down to speed up. It's sometimes to speed up, what you need to do is to slow down.
Sure.
It's like refueling your car. If you don't refuel your car because you're in a hurry, you will eventually be stranded on the side of the road. And the analogy for that is burnout or some kind of breakdown in the team, in the relationships, at work, or as you said, right, with your family, or even worse, with your health.
I have to say that again, it resonates with me. So I'm a big fan of the Performance Podcast, and actually I think this is quite an interesting time to mention this example, because we've just had for those that follow the Formula One Grand Prix finale, we've had the Verstappen win over Lewis Hamilton in the last minute. But in that Performance Podcast, they say that the race is won and lost in the pit stop. It's won and lost in that period of recovery, because in slowing down for those 20 seconds to get your tires changed and everything else, it allows you to go faster. Whereas if you go ahead, pedal to the metal the entire race, eventually your car fails, the wheel, the tires go, and you end up not finishing where you want to be. They talk, and that's not my anecdote, I've got that from the Performance Podcast, but it really resonated with me, because you're absolutely right. It's in those recovery periods, it's in those periods of reflection, those periods where we slow down, that actually enables us to speed up. That's something that worked for me anyway, listening to that example, and it was so prevalent in the race of the weekend.
I think that's a wonderful anecdote. That's a wonderful analogy, that the race is won in the pit stop. And I think it goes with everything in life. And one of the practices which I recommend both individuals and teams is to actually dedicate time in the calendars to do that alone and do that as a team as well.
Sure. So to bring it back to coaching just a moment, just to make sure that the audience have really picked up on the key points. What's the main relevance or importance of coaching then when it comes to leadership?
I can talk about coaching in either a personal capacity or in a team or leadership capacity. So from a personal capacity, I think many times we cannot see our own blind spots. So if I am a very action-oriented person, then every problem I face, every challenge I face, every dream or ambition, I will apply the same mentality there, right? So by definition, I will not be able to see the other side of the story or a different way to looking at things. Right, so I would not be able to slow down, maybe interview 5 people and then take their feedback, right? So I might miss a lot of things. So that's where coaching comes in personally, to show people what they cannot see by definition, because they are so good at something else, right? So it does not make sense for them in the moment to actually drop out what has worked for them. So coaching for me is a way to see the mirror, and you see the mirror. Why do we all see the mirror in the morning, right? We see the mirror because we want to see what we cannot see. We cannot see our face, so we look at the mirror and then we fix something if we see something new.
Yeah.
And the coaching metaphor is the same metaphor, that you work with a coach. The coach shows you a mirror, shows you what your skills are, what your strengths are, what are the dark sides of that strength. Yeah. And then that gives you an opportunity to do something about it. Whether you take action or not is still your choice, and you have complete choice with everything in coaching and leadership. But the biggest barrier is not even seeing that. So it's like that I don't even know that I don't know. And that's a very, very important distinction, because I do not know guitar. Like I can see guitar behind you.
Yeah.
I do not know guitar, but I know.
I'm not sure I do. They look nice though.
Yes. Yeah, but there is a difference, right? So I know that I do not know guitar. But there are many things which I do not even know that I do not know. And that's where a coach comes in.
So how do you deal with then? Because sometimes self-reflection can be a painful exercise. It's not something we're always, that we think we're open to it, and then suddenly someone comes, I'll use the word criticism. I'm sure you put it in a more delicate way. But the reality is we may look at that mirror and not always like what we are being told we're seeing or actually what we are seeing. So we don't always admit it to ourselves, right? So how do you get over those hurdles when quite clearly there's an issue there, quite clearly you've identified it, but for whatever reason or not, there's a defensive barrier, defensive wall that comes up in our leadership capabilities, which we don't like being questioned. Although the reality is very few of us are actually trained in leadership skill. We get to those roles through usually performance that doesn't involve leadership, which is quite an interesting conversation on its own. How do you as a skilled coach bring those walls down?
I think that's the second part of coaching, which I was talking about from a leadership perspective. Right. Coaching is also a leadership style or a way to communicate where you have the other person see what is missing for them. So you are a facilitator in the process. So it's not like the coach is telling them this is your weak spot, because that can immediately put you into a defensive state, as you said, right? So it's through a process of questioning and through a process of always taking permission to go deeper and to address some of those things, and then have the person through a conversation automatically look at what they might be missing. So the coaching process itself is creating that safe space, first of all, where you can have those conversations where you can slow down deliberately, like I'm doing now. So you can slow down deliberately. You can give space for those conversations which you don't normally have. You can give space for those defensiveness to come out or those emotions to come out. And then it's very important for the coach to not react, to hold the space. All right. So if somebody is reacting in whichever way, whether it's anger, whether it's emotion like sadness, or whether it's a very vulnerable position, it's important for the coach to hold the space, right? To create a container under which the person first of all can feel fully safe and to share whatever they want to share without the fear of being judged or being put into a box, again, put into labels. And I think that's a very important thing.
And this is something that I need to take on a little bit more, because as a podcast interviewer, as a recruitment interviewer, I'm interviewing all the time, which means I'm often listening with the intent to respond. But sometimes we just need to listen. without that intention piece, which is sometimes quite difficult for me anyway, because I'm already thinking about the next thing. But sometimes when you do that, you lose sight of where you are, and actually say space is so important. So I think you put that really, really well. So to turn this on its head a little bit, then we've talked about the self-reflective piece. What typically are the factors you see that regularly leads to excellence in individuals and team performance? You know, the role of talent or skill or ability and how that plays versus, as you mentioned at the start of this podcast, say workplace culture.
I think that's a very fascinating subject which I love to discuss, is because I see a lot of organizations and a lot of people, when it comes to their performance, they focus on their ability or they focus on their skills.
Yeah.
Right. And while all of that is important, and we have covered this from an individual perspective of coaching,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So all of that is important, but at the same time, when we work with teams, when we work in organizations, big and small, the culture of the team, the mood and the energy of the team and the organization plays a huge role. So I actually have an equation where I say performance is equal to ability plus the size of the company into the culture.
Okay.
So
nice.
the smaller the company is, the smaller your team is, your individual ability basically defines a huge amount of your performance. So if you are part of a startup which is 5 people, your individual ability of each person will drive the performance, your performance and also the company's performance. But once you are working in a 50 people company, as the size increases, the culture part of the performance equation grows bigger. And your ability, while it remains like the starting factor, it's the platform on which you build performance, but the culture can actually inhibit performance or it can pull it up. Okay. It can have these two impacts. And the bigger the company, the impact of the culture is the larger. And especially in large corporates, especially in large companies where tens of thousands of people are working, the impact that the culture has, and this is the missing I think a missing conversation in companies, that whenever there is poor performance, whenever there is lack of performance, people look at individuals rather than looking at the culture. So people look at what can we shift, how can we shift this person, or how can we train this person better to improve the performance, instead of asking what can we do with the culture so that it does not just increase the performance of this person, but also everybody who is impacted by something
Sure.
about the culture. Especially with teams and organizations, I think culture is a huge blind spot which we do not look at. We do not go into like breaking it apart and then putting it back together in a way that allows for performance rather than inhibiting performance.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a more holistic approach. And actually, I guess now, post-pandemic, a lot of companies have done this not by choice, but they've had to kind of pull their cultures apart and then re-pull them back together. We've got new ways of working, we've got new ways of flexibility, we've got remote management, new ways of recruitment, onboarding, all those things that come around it. As you mentioned earlier about, it's the outcomes we need to look at. And actually, we've moved into an outcomes-based leadership model now, because not everyone can do the micromanagement thing. So how have you seen I've given some examples which you referenced, but how have you really seen the pandemic influence workplace culture and leadership going forward? And do you see some of those changes as being positive ones as we move towards that more towards an output-based model?
I think in the short term the disruption is not positive, but okay. I think over the period of long term, the pandemic will be seen as a positive force in our economies, for our workplace, for our well-being, and so on. And as I said, the pandemic is bringing to the surface what was always there. Yeah. And one of those things is uncertainty and the unpredictability of working with people. Sure. Right? We have adapted to a very hybrid and a very remote world, while in the beginning everybody had their concerns of how will we adapt to not being in the office. So first of all, it again tied to learning, that if we are closed to learning from the pandemic, learning from a new way of working, and this might be different for companies, this might be different across countries, this might be different across industries. Right? Yeah, so without trying to standardize one set of principles or approaches and then put it everywhere, to really being open to listening to what is happening in my company, what is happening in my team, what are people liking about the remote world, what are people hating about the remote world, how can I not come in the way of what they are already liking, but how can I support what they are not liking, right? Rather than saying this, yeah. Because I have seen this work in this team or this company, to be really being open and then adapting, because it's an unpredictable world. We don't know what is going to happen next.
Sure.
So the adaptation is very important. And then again, from a culture point of view, a lot of the processes which we had in companies when we used to physically sit together are suddenly irrelevant when we are working remotely. So looking at those processes which we take for granted in companies and then readapting them to a new kind of world, and again experimenting, seeing what is working, giving people the autonomy to basically try it out different things in their teams, in their organizations, and then tie it together back again as a whole, as a company, and then bring it down.
Sure.
So I think it would be a big mistake if we start to keep all the same processes which used to happen physically, and then just expect them to work on like talking to screens, because talking to screens is very different than talking to a human being in person. So we cannot expect the same processes to have the same impact which they used to have in a previous pre-remote world.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important that as you've just done, that we remind ourselves that it's not the same as well. It is different, and it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking it's the same. I think, interestingly, certainly from a recruitment perspective, the clients that I've worked with, I do feel that those that have been most open to learning about how the pandemic has impacted their workforces, and those most open to change and being adaptable, have been those that have been most successful coming through the pandemic, as opposed to those that were resistant to change and tried to fight it, and they found they've had to adapt a little bit later through being forced to adapt. And I think that's a good a good example of an outcome there, where you say those that are most open-minded to it and open to learning and embracing it have actually been, from my perspective, those that have been most successful. What are a few simple steps then that leaders can take if they really want to expand their capacity and performance when it comes to leading people, or even for their own performance as well?
Yeah, I think especially with teams, I think one thing which the pandemic has brought up suddenly is the importance of empathy, is the importance of emotional intelligence, and how do you use that in your communication, especially when sometimes you're only talking to people on chat, sometimes you're only talking to people on audio, and sometimes you have video. So one thing which I say is that before emotional intelligence, you need emotional literacy. Right. So when you see somebody being closed, when somebody with you can see people in their body language. If somebody is being closed, do you even know what that means, right? And then do you address that? So this is also listening, but listening to beyond the words. So if you can listen to that and ask the person, right, you look a bit closed. Is there something on your personal side, or is there something from the work side which is happening that is making you fearful, or that is making you anxious? And then what can I do to support you, right? It might be nothing, but just asking that question can mean a huge world of difference to the other person. And then if there is something which is hidden, which you have done or the company is doing consciously or subconsciously, then that gives you an immediate action point to shift something on a context level, which will shift every conversation you have in the future. So the first thing is, I think, which is coming up is the communication and emotional intelligence. It is suddenly becoming much more critical. It is suddenly becoming much more important for leadership, especially for leadership role.
Sure. I mean, certainly, I know if I was holding this podcast and suddenly changed my own position, for those not, might be listening to this, if you're watching this on video, if I suddenly close my, cross my arms, lean back, it changes the whole feeling of the conversation, doesn't it? So, it's sometimes very easy to forget those visual cues. So I think it's good to be reminded of them, and it's equally as important in an interview scenario as well, which is something that we're dealing with regularly. And people forget, and I think, you're absolutely right. There's something behind the visual cue. We need to explore that and tackle that in more detail, for sure. So what do you often find then is missing in organizations, which is really preventing them, stopping them, I guess impacting either business, relational or cultural goals or cultural objectives they're trying to achieve at the moment?
Yeah. So there are two things which I would state here. One is exactly what I was talking earlier about teams. So because of the lack of focus on team performance versus individual performance, there is a belief that if you put 5 or 6 or 10 people together, that creates a team. Right? But in my eyes, that only creates a group of people. What creates a team is when there is a unified purpose, when there is a unified set of values, when there is a clear, and everybody has bought in into that. right? So and then to regularly have those conversations. So let's say you start with 5 people, 6 months down the line half the team has changed, but have you told those people what are the values, what is the mission, what is the purpose of the team? To regularly have these conversations with the team. Another set of conversations which I find that is missing is understanding what is everybody's role, and then how does the role decides what work is divided between people, and who is responsible for what. So one thing which I say is that every team member is not just responsible for their own work, but also for the entire team's output, and not in a way of burdening the person, but in a way that if they notice something which is missing for the team, they should be able to point it out. They might not be able to do anything about it, that's the team leader or the manager's job, but they should be open to point it out to whoever is actually accountable for that. And that's the difference between accountability and responsibility. So only the team manager or the team leader is accountable for the team's result, but everybody can be responsible.
Sure.
Right? So they can be responsible and they can bring up whatever concerns they have to the person who is accountable. And this is what...
So that secure environment is set up through the culture and the values and behaviors you set up at the start. It's quite empowering, isn't it? It must be empowering for those that, maybe look up to a leader, look up to a director. Maybe you're quite junior in a team, but actually having that ability to feel like you can be responsible and you can raise these issues must be really empowering for unlocking some of that potential. You're going to discover ideas and thoughts and processes that may never have come to the surface if you didn't have that level of engagement.
Yeah, it's very empowering. It totally shifts the mood of the team, I think, and I think we don't acknowledge that, but the mood in which people are working is very important, and it directly ties down to productivity. If your team is doing the same thing, but they're doing the same thing from a place of anxiety or from a place of curiosity, it will have a very clear impact on productivity in the long term, even if it is not in the short term. But to give this responsibility divided within the company without blame, right? Without blaming people, and to really being open to listening to what they are saying, actually just does not create empowerment, but also creates a mood and brings the team together rather than just being a group of people thinking in their own heads about their own interests. Everybody starts to think together for the team, and that is what separates a group of people from a team. So, and that focus on teams is, I think, what I see missing in organizations, and there is a huge scope of basically going after particular conversations, like conversations about the mission, the values, the standards, the boundaries, what we are trying to do, then the commitments, right? Does everybody know what the team has committed for the next month, for the next week, and what is their individual roles? And then do they have the authority, do they have the openness to actually point out which they feel is missing?
Sure, I think that's really insightful, Sumit. And actually, they say that every good conversation, starts with good listening. And the reality is, we all like to feel like we're being listened to. And it's a really powerful thing that we don't always do, but that power of feeling like you're being listened to is really, really important. And it builds trust. I've had podcasts with Stephen Covey on the speed of trust and the power of trust. And actually, if you haven't got trust in your team, everything else is quite superficial. If you can build that through some of the processes you've just mentioned there, I think it's a really insightful way of talking about the difference between a group of people, as you put it, and I've never considered it this way, and a team. And there is a distinctive difference, as you quite rightly pointed out, which is fantastic. So talking about values, I may well mention here, you've got on your website that you've got 4 core values yourself. I think you've listed courage, care and compassion, reflection and integrity. Can you expand on, well, 2 things really. One, why you particularly have selected these as your 4 critical core values, but also expand on why you think it's important that leaders and individuals also take the time to reflect on what their own core values are.
Yeah, I think your values are like the engine on which you runs, right? So if you do not know your value, then you're not even sure what is driving you, and you're not sure how do you want to deal with difficult situations or challenges, which will eventually come. And that is different from what I call a leadership lighthouse, which is a true north, which tells you where you are going. Okay. Which is basically, for me, leadership is important, so I'm a leadership coach. And photography is important for me, so I'm also a photographer on the side. So that's my true north, right? So if I'm not feeling happy, that tells me what am I not doing. It will be either for my work, which is very important to me, but the way I do it, is determined by my values. And particularly for me, why I have chosen courage is because I have struggled with courage so much in my life.
Okay.
And I have confused courage with confidence. And I have not taken action on my dreams, on my ambitions, on my teams, because I thought I did not have the confidence, while what was required was courage. And the way I separate these two out is that confidence is an outcome of doing something. So if I do something multiple times, I gain confidence. That's a natural process.
Okay.
Courage is what you require to do something for the first time, or to do something when there is uncertainty. Right? So courage is very critical to leadership, and a lot of people I see stop themselves because of lack of confidence, and which is just that misconception that I need confidence before I can act. While you don't need confidence. Confidence is the natural outcome of acting. If you do anything repeatedly, you will get better at it and you will build confidence. What you need is courage, and I have lacked that so much, or I have said that I lacked courage so much. And it is so important for me, because everything we talk about leadership is almost impossible unless we have the courage to go over like the saying goes, like a ship is not built to be at the harbor. And what is required to go beyond what is your comfort zone is courage. So courage is very important.
Nice. I love that distinction, by the way. It's yes. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think the integrity one is very important to getting things done. And for me, integrity is as simple as saying what you said you will do, and then not doing what you said you will not do.
Okay.
And then if you fail in this, because we are all human beings, we are all imperfect human beings. If we do not do what we said we will do, to actually go ahead and make amends with the people or with the parties who are affected. Which could be saying I'm sorry, which could be saying what can I do to make it up, or which could be saying I make a fresh promise that this will not happen again.
Sure.
Right. So this is without getting into any kind of judgment. This is integrity without making anybody right and wrong. This is a very neutral, task-based state of integrity, and that builds trust. So if I say something and I don't do it, this basically impacts my whole leadership. Right? So there is no leadership without courage. There is no leadership without integrity. So that's how I see integrity. Yes.
Okay. And so, I mean, these are your four. Do you think these four core values then should be applicable for most leaders, or should every leader find their own core values?
I think everybody has to decide their own core values, right? And because there is no one formula which fits all for every leader. Courage as an emotion, courage as an trait is something which everybody needs to build or cultivate. But to have this as a primary value, I think it depends on the situation you are in. This depends on the kind of challenge you are facing. If you are working in a company where things are pretty much settled, maybe you do not need that courage, but maybe you need something else. Maybe you need listening more. Maybe you need empathy more. Right? So it depends on everybody, and also depends on the situation. But the values which you pick and choose can obviously vary, and can obviously also vary over time for the same person.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm a big believer in the 20 seconds of courage. So, as you put it, nearly any task can be overcome if you're willing to be brave for 20 seconds. And after that period, whatever the task is, the task might be an hour long. It's the first 20 seconds that's the hardest. It's the getting started that's the hardest. So I always say, look, don't try and be brave for an hour. Don't try and be brave for half an hour, whatever the time frame is. Even if you use your boat example, it's not about having the courage of sailing from the UK to Australia. It's about getting in the boat, and that first 20 seconds of leaving the harbour will be the hardest part of your car. After that, it'll all start falling into place. So that's what I would try and break it down. For me anyway, hopefully it'll help others listening to this, because I use this all the time when I'm scared of something or I'm nervous about something. I was like, okay, Nick, I've got to be brave just for 20 seconds here. That's all it is. Let's count it down.
Yes.
And off we go. For me, that really helps anyway. Maybe it'll help others. Hopefully it will.
Yes, indeed.
Obviously, you're an expert on unlocking performance for leaders and very high level leaders as well. If you could give just one step, one piece, if I could narrow it all down and go, right, Sumit, you can only give me one piece of advice for unlocking potential, what would that piece of advice be?
I think it is to see leadership and to see all of these traits which we are talking about, like listening, courage, or even stuff like trust. and to see it on a moment by moment basis. So leadership is not something which is a trait which defines a person. So when we blanket a person by saying that he is not trustworthy, or even worse, like when we put it on ourselves, I am not a good leader, or I am not courageous, I am putting a blanket on my future as well as my past. Instead of doing that, take it on a moment by moment basis. So there is no such thing as a good leader or a bad leader.
Okay.
But there is something that, are you being a good leader in this moment? There is no such thing that I am courageous or I am not courageous. The only thing is, am I exercising courage in this moment or not? There is no such thing that I am trustworthy or not. The only thing is that, am I trustworthy in this moment? Am I being honest in this moment or not? So instead of keeping the focus on these traits which can basically blanket your whole life, bring it back to the present moment, right? In this moment, it doesn't matter if you call yourself lack of courage, but can you show courage in this moment? And which could be taking that tiny step.
Yeah.
Right. You might not see yourself as a leader, but can you do something which is a leadership quality in this moment, and that makes you a leader in that moment.
I like
so
that.
instead of taking all of these attributes, traits as long-term attributes which define a person, I think these are all practices which all of us can make a choice to practice in any given moment. And I think that's very empowering. It takes away the burden. It takes away the stress of taking up an umbrella view of it. And it's also very practical. It gives people an immediate action. Like, if I have to listen, what can I do right now to listen better?
I'll tell you what I love about it, and I think it's really powerful, Sumit. I'm glad I asked the question, and thank you so much for sharing. But I think it means that we should never be defined by anybody else. We should, we're not necessarily defined by what's been before. We can redefine ourselves at any moment. And if we're living in the moment, it's about how we define ourselves that's important, not how others define us. And I think, if someone says, often we think we're a bad leader because that's been defined by someone else, and we've taken on that criticism and we've accepted it, and now we start to believe it. We're manifesting ourselves, and we suddenly start thinking what someone else has said is true. What I like about your example is you can let all of that wash over you for a minute and just ask yourself honestly, whatever the action is you're trying to do, how am I feeling in this moment? That's how. And if you repeat those moments over time and you always live by them, then you will actually become what it is you want to be, right? So I think that's really powerful, and a great response. Thank you. Now I have to ask this. I saw on your website, which I should ask, it's going to be in the show notes. Please do check it out. There's a free newsletter on here. There's a number of resources. You can also, of course, book in with Sumit's for coaching and training, and there's a wealth of things on the website. But one thing on there is the website is deployyourself.com. And you've undertaken a number of book reviews, which people can read and follow on your website. I noticed you've actually reviewed a number of titles that I've actually read as well. I think most recently you reviewed You Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins, which I found a really interesting read myself. A fantastic book. If you haven't had a chance to check it out from my perspective. Of all the books you've read and reviewed, and you're very well read and you've reviewed so many titles, which is the one single title you would recommend to our listeners?
So that's such a difficult question, always, especially for somebody who loves book. So if I were to suggest, I think one or two, I would suggest Conscious Business by Fred Kaufman.
Okay.
I think which ties many of the things which we have spoken about today together in the context of business, in the context of leadership.
Sure.
But when it comes to books, I think it's again, what is the book for a particular skill? What is a book? So there is no one book, because every book is a conversation with the author. That's how I see it.
Sure.
So if I'm talking to a very senior leader in the military, they might be telling me something which is true for them, but which might not be applicable for me. So the reason I read a lot of books is to assimilate knowledge from multiple sources, and then to choose what works for me, rather than to choose what works for this person, or that expert to this person. So even if I'm coaching around leadership, I think one thing which I always say is that take whatever you take from the coaching, then make a choice to whether you want to implement in your life or not, and then to adapt based on what you see, rather than just taking something because Sumit said so, or because this leader said so, or this book said so.
Which is the book then that's had most resonance with you on your journey to where you are today? Has there been a particular book that stands out that's really helped you along? It doesn't have to be a business book, it could be a fictional or any kind of book, but is there something that's really helped you?
So for me, I also read a lot of autobiographies.
Yeah.
And I think those have helped me most to decide what kind of leader I am. And two autobiographies which I totally love and like revisit every few years is one is of Mahatma Gandhi, and the second one is of Theodore Roosevelt.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think the one with the recent one which I really loved is Nelson Mandela. It's not a recent book, but I read it recently, so it's still resonating very much with me. It's a huge volume of two books, but it's a wonderful read of the journey, I think, which we can still relate to because we have seen that in the news, we have seen that on TV.
Sure.
But to connect with what somebody was thinking and what thinking led them to act in a way that they acted, I think for me, autobiographies have shaped me more than business books. That's what I would say.
I would say I'm exactly the same. I'll be honest. Yeah, I love an autobiography as well. I have to say that I'd probably come back with the same the same response. Maybe different autobiographies, but certainly they help shape and is what I enjoy most, for sure. But Sumit Gupta, it's been an absolute pleasure. I think we could talk for hours on this subject. I must direct everyone to your website. There's so much to take away from that as well. But we're going to open the HR L&D vault, which are going to be 4 short, sharp questions, if you can. So the first one is this: in hindsight, what is the one thing you now know that you wish you'd known when you began your career?
That I do not need to be ready to do something new. Readiness will come after that. I can just start.
I love that. That was straight off the bat. That was very fast. That was brilliant. Okay, excellent. If you could give one piece of advice to the world to help everyone working in human resources, what would it be?
Listen. Just that. Focus on listening. Yeah.
Amazing. If you had the opportunity, what advice would you give a younger you just starting out in the new world of work?
I think be open to ideas which you do not believe in.
Nice. I'm loving these. These are great. By the way, I've given you no prep on these, so I'm amazed by the speed of response. And the last one: what is the single guiding principle or behaviour that you've seen in every great or inspirational leader?
I think seeing and then creating a great future.
Fantastic. Sumit, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the HR L&D podcast today. If people want to find out more about yourself, I know obviously I can direct them to deployyourself.com. There will be a link in the show notes with all those resources I've mentioned about, including a free newsletter. So please do check that. It can really help unlock your potential with the insights that Sumit sends through on a regular basis. But any other links or social media places you'd like to direct the audience to?
So apart from what you just shared, I think I'm very active on LinkedIn. So anybody is free to approach me on LinkedIn or leave a question or leave a comment, and I would be very glad to interact with that person.
Fabulous. I'll make sure your LinkedIn URL is also included in the show notes. So you can click through and send an invite directly to Sumit through the show notes. And of course, if you are an HR L&D leader listening to this podcast right now, it just leaves me to say, please do get in touch with one of my team if you need support recruiting an HR L&D professional. You can access our team at www.jgarecruitment.com. And it just leaves me to say a huge thank you for joining me once again on the HR L&D podcast. I wish you all a fantastic Christmas and a happy new year. I look forward to speaking to you all again real soon. Thank you very much, Sumit.
Thank you, Nick.